This episode of Between Turns is brought to you by the Foundation for Bored and Barely Relevant Podcasters, inviting you today to get involved by liking Between Turns on Facebook, leaving a review on iTunes, or joining the Between Turns Guild over at Board Game Geek, where you can join the discussion of how wrong Between Turns often is. Hey, it's my show.
Yeah, you know how many Eklund games I played this week? Like literally, I've been bathing in them. I'll have to go back and look. It's probably been like 12 of them.
It probably has been.
Yeah, really. I mean, for real, not even exaggerating. It's been like a 20-hour work week of nothing but Eklund games, but they were pretty much awesome across the board, so it was a good time.
I was going to say it's definitely kind of a mode of play, at least from my, we'll call it baptism into Eklund.
A draft.
Yeah. my forcible baptism, which I think is just drowning.
Oh, I know I didn't give you much choice. I do know that. It's like, here you go, John. Here's your dinner for the next 3 weeks.
But once you're kind of in that headspace, it wasn't bad jumping in between them. I think the first game we played was the most work, right? Because
absolutely,
we were having to kind of shift over into that play mode. But once we were there, it became much more easy to jump between the games.
Yeah, you know what was really bad? So last night, I put the colonists up as, we're going to toy around with that tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And that's supposed to be like this 8-hour-long, super heavy Euro, complicated, brain burner AP monster. And I think I have Stockholm Syndrome because I read the rule book and I was like, that's it? Like, seriously? Like, I can teach this game in like 6 minutes. I was like looking, thinking like half the rule book got, the staple came out and it was still in the box. I had no idea what to do with myself because I blew through the colonist rule book in like 6 minutes and it was nothing. And I know it's not that. I mean, it's everybody says it's a heavy Euro and stuff. So this is what 3 weeks of immersing yourself in Phil Eklund rule books will do to you.
Honestly, I wonder if we're going to end up skipping over a lot of the AP problems that people have, because the key to playing the Eklund games at a brisk pace is eliminating extraneous information, which both means, the parts of the cards that you don't need to look at to make your decision because they're just the history, and parts that, icons that don't refer to the part of the game you're in. But then the other thing that you kind of have to just eliminate is the stuff that frankly doesn't pertain to either the turn that you're in right now, the ramifications of the turn before that you're trying to recover from, or if both of those things are covered and you actually can plan ahead, which is a rarity, then just looking forward to exactly the next turn. Because anything beyond that is basically just fiction, because the game is so brutal that when you stop trying to play it like it's chess and you play each one of those games like they're just turn-by-turn survival, it actually moves really quickly. And so I wonder if, because we've been in this headspace of taking every turn as a turn, instead of a snapshot of this large, massive strategy, I wonder if we're going to end up kind of zipping through that one because we're making our decisions so quickly.
I think so. I mean, I think the AP from that is more from trying to optimize your moves. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it may be the later ages of that game or what slows it down, and that may make us move slow too. I don't know. But it was just weird to go back to a normal Euro-style rulebook.
After reading encyclopedias and history books.
No, they're not even that. They're technical manuals. It's like I reached into the glove compartment of the space shuttle and just started flipping through the owner's guide. Yeah, Yeah, it was pretty crazy. And then we did BIOS Genesis. Again, it's like an 89-page book of jargon. And then you play it. Honestly, it plays like a really nice, simple Euro with dice used on the side just as, just to determine the chaos, because all the games are about chaos trying to disorganize, the thing you're building. So the dice have a place there and they're fine, but I mean, the structure of the game was very simple. I mean, it was choose where you want to put your resources, see if they work, take those resources and buy something with them, and then add that to your machine, and then see if your machine passes the test.
Yeah, I was about to say, cross your fingers for the next card flip, really.
Yeah, and do it again. But I mean, it's not even any different than something silly like Steampunk Rally or something where you're having an auction or whatever, taking a card or a draft or whatever the case may be, and then taking that card and adding it to your engine and then seeing if it passes a test. I mean, it's Galaxy Trucker, right?
Yeah.
You know, so, and that is the structure of that game. And it's, I mean, really, I mean, you can teach it in 5 minutes.
He's done a huge favor to people, and I don't imagine that people go on a steady Eklund diet for 2 weeks like we have, but for those that do, he's kind of, I'm sure he was doing himself the favor, but he's done us the favor of all the games sort of having a very similar structure, be they his science games, you know, like Genesis and even Neanderthal and Greenland. I would sort of put those in those types of games. Like, the structure is really similar. It's auction, allocation, risk, resolution, and everything follows that structure. And once you realize that, and you understand that you're sort of in these phases, and again, you just need to look at that one phase and the phase before and after. Even though there's tons of jargon and all this kind of stuff, you can break it down into these simple things, because ultimately this stuff sort of pushes and pulls, right? And if the phase structure is the same and you can understand the interaction between things, the game actually starts working very smoothly. And even with the historical games, like the PAX games, those even kind of have a structure in and of themselves, which is similar across the board. Even though the games operate differently and they feel very different, you have this familiar structure which kind of helps you mount that curve of learning a new game that's so crunchy.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I mean, maybe on the historical side, I think Pax Pamir, I mean, the more I play it, the less it feels connected to those games. You know, it's almost like a different game made with the same layout. No, I mean, seriously, because it just doesn't. Because Pax Renaissance does feel like Pax Porfiriana. Mm-hmm. You know, when you really, really break it down, you're doing the same things as far as opportunistically grabbing something from the market and then putting it in your tableau, and then, you know, using that to grab more things from the market, and you're kind of engine building a little bit. Whereas Pax Pamir doesn't feel like engine building so much to me. It's like you're more like allocating your allegiances and building a little command board that you're going to start pushing the buttons on over and over again, and then negotiating and everything. So I don't know, that one just, and I think it's because, you know, it's got a different designer. Even though it's structurally similar to the other PAX games, it doesn't feel the same at all. It's weird to me to have that in the same family of games, because it is, again, like, it's like someone took all the cards from Pax Porfiriana and made a second game out of them. And it's a game that's really good and super fun. Like, I think Pax Pamir is brilliant. I have zero complaints about it. It is a super fun game. But it feels weird, especially, again, now after having 3 weeks of just being neck deep in Eklund games from Eklund. Yeah. You know, that it makes that one stand out a little more as being kind of an oddball when taken against the whole of the other games. But, yeah, anyway. Weird thoughts on PAX.
What I'm trying to. So Porfiriana was, I think, the first one we played in the marathon, and so it's the one that I'm kind of fuzziest on. But in Pax Porfiriana, you're a businessman who is in a place where, you know, they've seen Mexico throw off Spanish colonial rule. They've seen Mexico resist two monarchies, you know, even when supported by foreign governments, and now they're sort of looking at this dictatorship and thinking, this probably isn't going to last, and they're trying to position themselves correctly, right?
Yeah. When was? Alrighty. All right, continue. Carry on. Now that we've lost, now that we've lost the thread,
I didn't make it up. Anyway, the where I was gonna go with that was in Pax Renaissance. You are a Renaissance era banker, right? You're one of the banking barons, barons.
Renaissance banker.
You're a Renaissance era banker, and you're sort of navigating the turbulent times that all of the governments were having with the churches, right? Because codified religious structures like the Catholic Church were just as powerful as nations. And so you are navigating not only the national identities, but these religious identities in terms of large institutions to try to basically profit. And in Porfiriana, if I remember correctly, you're a businessman who is basically trying to navigate this turbulent time in Mexico. Now we're sort of at this juncture where suddenly things are about to go democratic, possibly, and you're trying to sort of flip back and forth in between the sort of active and vocal parties at that time to sort of set yourself up to profit. So those games have a very similar structure in terms of what role you as the player are taking. And Pamir, you essentially are playing almost like a local warlord, and you're basically just trying to sort of vie your allegiance to whatever group is going to win. It's such a minor difference, right? Because in both Porfiriana and Renaissance, it's not that if you get a holy victory, for example, by pushing Catholicism, it's not that the Catholic Church wins. It just means that you now, because of your dealings with the Catholic Church, have now profited as a banker to the point that you now have an empire that can't be taken down as a banker.
Right.
And in Porfiriana, it's kind of the same thing. What actually happens in the future, quote unquote, is completely not necessary to the narrative of what you, the player, are doing, because you're just trying to set yourself up to be in the best position. Whereas in Pamir, the implication, I mean, this isn't necessarily exactly like the end condition of the game, but the implication is that if you're allied with the Russians and the Russians sort of take it, it effectively means the Russians win and you went with them.
Yeah.
And it's such a minor change, but it is pretty significant, I think.
I would even get finer than that. I think if I had to define the three games, I would say that Pax Porfiriana, you are actively trying to win. You know, not just the game, but your character in the game is trying to win the presidency. You know, you are trying to seize control. So Pax Porfiriana has a very kind of character-driven, you know, the player role in that is that this is happening to you. And in the game, you are trying to position yourself to seize the power and win. In Pax Renaissance, you are doing that same thing, but like you said, you're not trying to win control of any government. You're not trying to win power. You are simply trying to win your security. I mean, you don't care who wins. It doesn't matter if the Catholic Church wins. It doesn't matter if Islam sweeps over the entire Western European continent. It doesn't matter to you. All that matters is that they are financing those moves through you. So you are growing your business, but you're not directly tied to anyone. And then Pax Pamir is weird because in Pax Pamir, the conceit is you've already lost. Like you are playing the losing faction automatically. And what you are trying to do is be on the right side of the eventual winner between, you know, Britain and Russia, or your own Afghan, you know, noble. But whoever those players are, they aren't you. And you don't really care who wins between them. You just want to be on their side when the win happens.
Yeah. It's all about coattails.
Yeah. And I think the weird part about that, among the three of them, like the difference and where I don't know that a lot of people would want to play all three because they are so different. A more likely scenario is that you find one that you really, really like, and that's the one you play a lot and get the most out of. And I think that the differences in those kind of agencies are what's going to make a person like those games or not like those games. Pax Porfiriana rewards a very direct manipulation of the world. You know, that I'm going to make these moves. I'm going to do things to my opponent. I'm going to take the spoils, and I'm going to use those resources to do what I want to do. And it's very direct, and it's very hands-on, and you sort of have a lot of control over that aspect of the game. Where Pax Pamir is very kind of hands-off, very, you know, you kind of just wait to see what develops, and you kind of set things up a little bit, and then you push, but you don't push too far, and you're just kind of riding the waves a little bit. That actually also has an appeal because it feels more dangerous. You know, if you're really getting into like the RPG mental state of this game where you're trying to like embrace these roles and who you are in the game and that sort of thing, it feels very life and death a lot of times. Like it's a pretty stressful situation when you are equally balanced between, say, the British and the Russians. You can go either way really right now, but when you make one move against either side, you kind of lose. You've committed, and you lose everything that you've been working on all game, to be in the middle. And the way to play that game is to kind of sit in the middle until you see an opportunity to go all in on a side. And when that moment comes, it feels dangerous. It feels stressful to be like, once I do this, I can never go back. And I think that's a really neat thing that Pax Pamir captures. And then, the other side of that is Pax Renaissance, which is Pax Renaissance is almost the opposite of Pax Pamir, to where nothing in Pax Renaissance feels dangerous. Like there's no part of that feels like your decisions are going to end up with you getting your head lopped off. It's just not going to happen. Because granted, if the noble sees all your money and you're bankrupt, that would destroy your family and you die in poverty and things wouldn't be good for you, being it's the Middle Ages and all. But realistically, it's a game of hiding in the shadows and kind of setting up dominoes, and then waiting for someone else to knock them over. And because of that, it feels really, in some ways and to some people, very disconnected. That there's not a lot of risk involved because nothing can happen to you. You never get your hands dirty in Pax Renaissance. You are just kind of setting the table and then waiting for money to flow to you from the things that you set them up, but you did not set them in motion. Yeah. And I think the people that like the Pax Porfiriana and the Pax Pamir might feel a little bit cold about Renaissance because you are so far removed from the action. It's such a bigger theater that you are removed from it. The danger feels gone. The stress of committing to a side is gone. None of that matters. But at the same time, the people that's going to appeal to, are the people that ultimately the win can be more satisfying, I think, in Pax Renaissance a little bit. Because the idea of it has that feel of master plans and manipulation and setting up those dominoes and then watching the other players in turn knock them down for you and have the board look exactly like you wanted it to when it gets to be your turn is incredibly satisfying. So and that kind of power grabbing, it feels completely different. But if you like that sort of planning, and watching those, the supervillain kind of, side of things, if that appeals to you, that Pax Renaissance, I think, delivers a lot more on that. But point being, altogether, though, it makes them feel completely unique from one another, even though they share a lot of the same traits. The end result, it feels like there's a game there for everyone that's willing to take the plunge.
I agree. I think ultimately it does come down to the feel, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I was kind of struggling to say this at the table, and as per usual, it takes the drive home for me to figure stuff out. But Porfiriana almost felt like surfing. You're just sort of along for this ride, and then when the topple cards come out, it's like everyone freezes, and it's like, okay, who's still standing, right? And who's potentially able to take this right now. And we kind of get through that one, and then we're just kind of back surfing and just surviving, right? And then suddenly there's another tense moment. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's almost a bit like the science games, where you're just trying to survive, and then get to that critical moment, and who's just an inch ahead of everyone else.
You can kind of look at that. That's a part of it, capturing the theme so well, and what I just talked about. In that Pax Porfiriana is a game about you having agency and you trying to be the one that seizes power. And I think what you just described is why that game feels that way, because what you are doing is you are a businessman and you are just going about your business, right? So it doesn't matter if I'm invested in ranches in Sonora and you are doing gold mines in Texas or wherever, whatever the cards say. It doesn't matter what the story you're building is, but you're in gold, I'm in cattle. There is no real reason for us to be kind of aligning with anyone. We're just going about our business, which is the surfing, right? You're just you're seizing opportunities. I may dabble in a gun store. I may dabble in financing the Mexican banking system with my extra money that I've made from cattle. But you're right, I'm surfing opportunities as they present themselves. And then when the topples come, that's an opportunity to knock the president off, the leadership role, and now there's a vacuum. And we all look around and go, "Hey, we're all rich and powerful. Who can grab this?" And then that's when you're looking, and it's funny because that is what triggers all of your interactions and your moves that aren't serving, your moves that are not surfing, the moves that are you actually at that moment is when you try to react to what the other players are doing, to react to what's the board state, and to try to find answers and try to manipulate things, to either be the one that takes this moment in history, this whatever the calamity that has struck President Diaz. At that moment, you stop and look around and you try to take advantage of it, catapult yourself into that leadership position. And that's why I think that surfing thing you just talked about is why that feels so much more personal and directly, being the player, being the agency that is trying to seize the power, and that's what pulls you into that game as a protagonist. That's a very apt description that you gave as to why it's just surfing, and yet that surfing is what delivers that feeling of the game as you being the protagonist in the story.
Mm-hmm. But not only just being the protagonist, but being that specific type of, you are essentially a land-owning entrepreneur in a chaotic time. And that is essentially the mode of operation, is that you're sort of taking each opportunity as an isolated thing and just going thumbs up, thumbs down, but understanding that stuff bumps into other stuff. And I say that specifically because Pax Renaissance, on the other hand, is you as this banker that's just sort of sitting behind all of those entrepreneurs, understanding that those are the people that are going to be taking those sort of at face value opportunities that are sort of bumping horizontally. But you're behind all that. And so it doesn't really feel like surfing. It feels like investing in opportunity. And you're investing in basically a domino that you're pretty sure at some point will fall. And if you have more of those dominoes than anyone else, when that thing does fall, you're going to sort of be in a better position. That is just a really cool little twist, because as we finished the first game of Pax Renaissance, I made the comment that in Porfiriana, everything kind of seemed parallel and like it was just bumping into all these other things, and you had to understand action and reaction. Whereas Pax Renaissance, you had all the same stuff, but they were layered. Instead of just bumping horizontally, it's almost like you had to look through one thing to see what was below it and understand like this three-dimensional Venn diagram, right? But I think that is firmly entrenched in the thematic mechanics of simulating being a banker versus simulating being a isolated business owner. And it's such a subtle little shift, but it kind of takes me back to our conversation about the difference between Venus and the Gallerist, and how those are essentially the same games but from different perspectives. And I think that Porfiriana and Renaissance are largely the same game but from different perspectives. And because of that, they feel so different. And that's why they kind of feel a little bit more linked, is because, like I said, you're looking at the same conflict from these two interlinked perspectives, whereas Pamir, it's obviously a similar conflict, but the perspective is outside that little construct of business owners and investors and that kind of stuff.
Right, yeah, you're right. You're playing a fairly powerless character, I think, in Pax Pamir. There's not a lot of commerce happening there, right? So you're not really building an engine in Pax Pamir. You are setting up, in Pax Pamir, you're setting up a network of spies.
Mm-hmm.
The whole game is a network of spies.
Mm-hmm.
There is nothing happening there that is gaining you wealth from turn to turn. There's no long-term prospects. Like I said, the main conceit of the game is, as the governor of this small Afghan town, you have already lost. The question is, who do you want to be your master, and what are you going to do to make sure that is what happens?
Yeah. Or specifically, it's who's going to give you a better office.
Right. It has the same survival and self-servingness. I mean, it is about people trying to secure power. But you don't have the same agency as far as long-term buildings. It's more about establishing that spy network and then determining which side you're going to use it for, which is what gives it that different feel as far as what the protagonist story is in that game. As far as Pax Renaissance goes, the scope of that game, is kind of what by necessity removes you from the direct control as well. There's no part of it that's going to be about you reaching up and grabbing power, because that was a time of nobility, and that just wasn't possible for a commoner to be a king. So there was no time you were going to wait for something to happen to the King of England so you could step in there. That just wasn't feasible. However, what that game is about is that the bankers became incredibly powerful, but that power was always so tenuous because the nobles were full in their right to just come take your money when you close your bank and take your money whenever they needed it. Mm-hmm. And that was the danger of the merchant life, is you didn't have your own armies. You had nothing to protect your money. You were in every country. You were there by the will of the king. And the king he loved having you because he could just, you were doing all the work of bringing in the money, bringing in the gold from all over the world. So whenever he needed it to prosecute a war or something, hey, look at the coffers. The coffers are a little low. I'll just go to the bank. And what are they going to say? No, because if they say no, I'll just take it. Mm-hmm. And that's the game you're playing throughout Pax Renaissance. Is the kings are literally robbing you every time they need to raise an army. And the game then becomes a matter of setting it up, and you start manipulating the stories to set it up so that the nobles are robbing your neighbors and not robbing you when it comes time to do those things. You start a fight on the other side of the world where you're not invested, and now the two guys on the other side of the table there, you just watch their bank accounts drain. Mm-hmm. As the Holy Roman Empire and Hungary start bashing swords. And I think that's really fun, and it tells its own great story. Even though you as a protagonist are not going to walk away from it being I've united Europe as the king of all Europe. I mean, that's just not a thing that can happen. But the story it tells is still pretty fascinating, I think.
I think that telling a good story is something that is embedded in exactly what that game is intended to do. Because let's be just straight to the point, and that is Pax Renaissance and Porfiriana are like all other Eklund games in that they are simulations. The thing about simulations is that they end up telling fantastic stories, because ultimately, even in something like Renaissance, where you're sort of playing this puppet master who's setting up, who's investing in opportunities, hoping that they put themselves in a better place to sort of start this chain reaction or whatever, or just benefit when the chain reaction is started for them. The mechanisms by which you're doing that are opportunistic in nature. And that is very much the part of real life that simulation games give you, is that at any moment, there's unequal things on the board. However, where you are may actually bring two things that are statistically unequal into alignment, just because you have a different ability to sort of utilize those opportunities that the cards give you. And so that opportunism is exactly what creates those stories, because something that may be completely mundane to another player in your hands could suddenly turn the tides of the entire game, and that makes for a fantastic do you remember the time when tale. And I think that that's 100% built into what those two games do, because they are first and foremost simulations. complete with all of those odd little things that you wouldn't have predicted, and that just when you lay all the cards out could sometimes seem kind of wonky. And that just makes for such great stories.
Oh yeah, definitely. And then, and it also helps too, even with the story side of things. Honestly, this is about the Renaissance, and if you are a fan of history at all, the Renaissance was one of the craziest times in the history of the world. As far as all of the changes that were happening, and everything focuses on Italy all the time with the art. But as Pax Renaissance shows you, if you blow that up to a global scale, it was so much more than that. I mean, there was all that stuff with the with the churches that were these monoliths for so long started to split and break apart, and the different characters, quite frankly, that we all already have stories and we already know about. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, that makes the storytelling even better, because these stories become even more interesting when you start taking these players that didn't interact in real life
and smashing them together.
Yeah, and then you merge those together. Like, seriously, like, what does happen when Vlad the Impaler meets Michelangelo, right? I mean, it's just kind of really kind of fascinating, having these characters that already have these great stories from real history, and then putting them in a blender and making even more great stories. Mm-hmm. It takes what could be a very dry thing and just makes it so much fun, even when you factor in all the frustrations of learning an Eklund game and those hurdles. As much as we rubbed our foreheads with furrowed brows, just as many times as that happened was another time where we were on the floor cackling because of some crazy weird encounter that is feasible, but never happened in real life. It's just so much fun.
Let's be clear, though. I mean, just because it is an Eklund simulation, yes, everything can fall apart, and there's nothing the players can do about it in some cases. Like, I mean, that sometimes it just happens that the deck will skunk you.
Right.
The first game of Renaissance we played, I don't think we had a single card that came out that actually opened up trade routes. For some of us, that was debilitating. And because it's a simulation, sometimes that stuff just happens. However, there is still a great game there. And I think that, and this is where I may get in trouble, but, I think for people that sometimes have a hard time grasping how good Eklund's designs are as games, sometimes they're just sort of not understanding where the decision space necessarily is. And they're not living in that sort of moment to moment, okay, let's just take a look at the board state and just see what I can do with what's on the table and just make the best of this. Because I know for a lot of folks, when a game is that tactical, when the game actively takes your notion of strategy and dismantles it in front of you, that can be excruciating. These games being so heavily tactical, though, while for a lot of people that, they may just go, this is a luck fest, it's way too random, I can't really interact with it. My response to them is, no, this game is so difficult to sort of figure out what is the best individual move at any time, that all players are having to do that all the time, and it's very, very, very difficult. And so it's a very rewarding exercise. And I think people that can juggle all those balls are going to get the consistent victories just the same way that they would in a strategy game, even though it is a tactics-heavy game because of the nature of the simulation. And I think it just sort of takes a bit of a reframing like that to see the value in it. I mean, now, let's back up. I love simulation. I mean, it's the reason I love war games. I love the stories they tell, and I love seeing the way that mechanics are tweaked. I mean, we all the time joke about all the odd changes in the rules. Even as you teach the game, you give me a 15-minute explanation of how the game works, and then every single action that I do for the next 2 hours, you go, okay, well, let me explain the thing I didn't explain about that because, well, Eklund, right?
Right.
And for a lot of people, that can be frustrating.
I may have muttered that a couple times during my Genesis.
But it's beautiful because, one, it absolutely reinforces what we're doing. Even though I love history and spend a lot of time learning and reading about this stuff, I came over from that game with much more clear understanding and ideas about the material of topic, because everything was matched thematically and mechanically, which, by the way, is one of the big veils you have to rip off of it in order to understand these games. Is you have to understand the theme, or at least be willing to understand the theme, to see why things behave the way they do mechanically. And once you do, the games are smooth as silk.
Right.
But at the same time, it's super clever and cool. It reinforces all of that tactical stuff that you're doing with theme, but still ends up making a great game because everyone is immersed in it all the time. It's frankly no different than the conversation that you have around a game that is incredibly cutthroat. You know, we have lots of people that we've come across who just say, nope, it's a hyper cutthroat game. I'm not interested in it. But then the irony is, you put a game in front of them that is nothing but cutthroat, suddenly it works, and no one gets their feelings hurt because you're totally immersed in it, and you realize that that is the game. It's not just being mean. Right. That is the strategy.
You have no choice but to be cutthroat because that's the primary mechanic. Like
exactly.
It isn't you have the option to choose to be cutthroat on the side if you want to, and you're a dick. Yeah. But the whole game is revolved around that, and that way, you know, no one has to be the bad guy because we all have to do it. That's the prime mechanic in the game.
Yeah. And so for these games, it's not that it's tactics heavy and strategy light. No, it's tactics. Like that is what it is. It is moment to moment. Can you use your situational awareness to actually understand where you are and what's going on and how this one thing affects another one?
Yeah,
and that
it's
is
life. It's life.
Yeah,
it's simulating. It's simulating life as whether you're a land baron or a banker or, you know, whatever you're doing. Life is about taking the steps and doing the things that allow you to live another day, but at the same time being able to seize opportunities when you spot them. And that's exactly what the historical simulation games, or I should say the historical games from Phil Eklund's catalog, those all do that. You know, you were just taking whatever move is available to you that puts you a little bit ahead right now, while at the same time keeping an eye out for opportunities that are going to let you jump further ahead as far as securing your victory. Mm-hmm. And you know, I don't see any argument against that. I mean, it feels like a nonsense argument to say that is a bad game. Well, I mean, I understand it's tactical, but when you're talking history, if you really look at it, I mean, how much of everything that's happened in the world is a bunch of little random factors lining up in a certain way? You know, you look at the conquest of the New World, Christopher Columbus, villain or not, that particular voyage had a pretty drastic effect on the next 400 years of history on Earth. And you know how hard it was for him to get that funded? I mean, there was 100 times that he could have just been like, nope, not happening, and just went home and did something else. And then the next 400 years don't happen, or they start 300 years later and have a totally different outcome, which may have been a better outcome. You know, it may have been a better outcome, but it's not the outcome that happened in it. And it happened just because of random chance that he got that money and was able to do that voyage, and everything else happened after that. You know, and to me, that's what these, you know, that's what PAX Renaissance specifically, and also Pax Porfiriana and all the Eklund games kind of do, is that they are basically representing all of the butterfly wings flapping, you know, and you are engaging, you know, because you see it as an opportunity, and you engage it, and now you sort of lock down that moment of that path of history, and then you continue along it to see where it goes. That's just a fascinating sandbox to play in, and I don't feel it's disingenuous with what the game is trying to teach you. You know, and it doesn't make it not be a game or not have strategic value, because I think the gameplay there, what the gameplay in PAX games, what it represents, honestly, is hedging bets, right? You are gambling that it's probably a pretty good idea to be pushing the agenda of the Mexican revolutionaries. And historically, that is going to be the path that gives you the most support. That is the way that is most likely to work. And to someone living in Mexico during that time, surrounded by the Mexican army, that was probably the easiest way to go, right? Is to kind of whatever. But because it's a Phil Eklund game and because it's a sandbox, you shuffle those cards, and there may not be any revolutionaries even in the deck. There may only be Union troops crossing the border from Texas for some reason. And the game is about deciding, wow, there's a lot of American presence here. Maybe American intervention is how I can grab that power. Now you're hedging your bets, and you're like, I'm going to back off this, and I'm going to start putting my money. I'm going to start feeding the USA some money and see if I can manipulate that into the United States coming down and laying claim to Mexico, and now we're the 48th state instead of Hawaii, and go for there. Maybe that's how it works. I don't know. But the point being is, I think being that it's a game of essentially gambling on the future and then hedging your bets means that those tactics, they couldn't be anything else. If you could plan that I'm going to take control of the Pope in the year 1684, I don't think that game is as fun. It's not. So yeah, I think that argument is nonsense as far as these not being strategic games and just being purely tactical. It may be purely tactical, but I don't think that's I don't think that invalidates it as a strategy game.
Yeah, I agree, and maybe I wasn't clear, but that's essentially what I'm saying, because so many people think that the game is happening to you rather than you being the first force, right? You feel like you're just responding to what comes at you, and my response to that is, yes, exactly. And what those games are about is aiming yourself so that when the game kicks you, the result is you being sent to a place you want to go. I mean, that is really difficult to do well, but it's really fun when it works. Well, it's fun when it doesn't work too, but it's incredibly novel in such a heavy game. I mean, clock building is cool, but so is whitewater rafting. And for anyone that's willing to stick with the game past those sort of moment-to-moment changes and tactics and see through the complexity of the rule books, because I mean, those games they're really simple once you get a few plays under your belt, and you can start to see the pacing of the game and the opportunities to position. And because of the whirlwind of events that's happening on the table, there's just so much to be said about the simple action of positioning yourself and waiting for the boot.
Yeah. It may come as a surprise to people, too, after they play their first 3-hour nose in the rule book, beating head against the table game, but they really do play in under an hour. Mm-hmm. when you understand the basic framework and the rules. Those games play in under an hour, which is also an amazing piece of work to get that kind of scope and have it fit in that time frame. Most other games you see on the topic, like Here I Stand or whatever, for the Renaissance, you play Here I Stand, it kind of covers the same material more or less, but you're looking at an 8-hour game. You know what I mean? And for Pax Renaissance to tell that story in under an hour is pretty remarkable. And to have delivered you a story, which it does, is pretty great.
Well, it doesn't just deliver you a story. I mean, it's delivering dozens of stories, both real and fiction.
Right. It depends on which path you go down. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the card is telling you the actual historical story, right, of the person or event that's depicted. And it's rad because that history is then turned into some sort of almost like math for the game. For example, in Pax Renaissance, there's a mechanic where you can have the entire country's monarchy in your pocket simply by laying claim to a future queen, who you then marry off to a controlling monarch, and you gain value and of course, a bit of control in that country. And that's something the players see often. Well, there's this one card that is the crown the Pope gave to the first ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. And in game terms, it functions just like a queen, in that it gives you control of the monarchy for as long as you can hang on to it. Well, we laughed to no end about this card because the text on the card, I mean, it tells you the history of the relic and of the office that it's representing.
Right.
But it also tells you how, in these just insanely corrupt times, it wasn't uncommon for bribes to be offered for the crown. You know, I mean, the crown was essentially bought and sold. So true to historical form, in the game, the card can be sold away for a double payout if you're willing to, you know, right, quote unquote, take the bribe, right?
And give up the monarchy. Like you actually lose control of the Holy Roman Empire. If you sell the crown for that money, you also lose control of the Holy Roman Empire because you sold the crown. You basically sold the kingship away to someone else.
Right. And it's letting you take part in telling that one story of this one crown, but in the larger play that was the Renaissance.
Oh, for real.
And the game is just full of stories that are equally fascinating. I mean, this is a game where not a single event or character is mundane. They're all just unbelievably interesting. And when you get them all together and see those fictional interactions, the whole thing becomes really bizarre, but still fascinating when you start to see the butterfly effect and wonder, I mean, you know, who would have been the recipient of the contract to go across the Atlantic, and what would that explorer have done? You know, but if you're willing to see it, there are some absolutely hilarious interactions that can bring levity to a game turn that may not have been going your way. If you're willing to see that thematic hilarity of weaving a narrative around the interaction of two groups or events that in reality had nothing to do with one another. This is actually where we ended up spending a lot of our laughter time, you know, by the way, was just trying to make sense of events as a cohesive narrative. And that narrative was just bonkers at times because what the game was doing and what we were doing. But just what a treat that you can mess around with history like that and be learning while you're doing it. I mean, I genuinely hope that people will elevate these particular games in their personal esteem as works of value to understand history, you know, the way that they have with other games that have tried to take on really messy and hard to process periods of history and have used the medium of games to lay those out in interesting ways where it starts to become easy to understand the important people and events, but more importantly, to understand the interactions that were going on at that time that sort of caused some of those events to happen the way they did. And to learn something that might be hard to understand, you know, from those times in history. But to go all the way back, I mean, for this game, it's just about the feel. I mean, it's significant that you can give so much knowledge, just textbook, encyclopedia knowledge in a game, but yet attached to it, it's not like an emotion. It's almost like a frame of mind, right? To why people might have been making those decisions. And yes, this is partly product of it being a simulation, but I think it just goes to show that when Eklund dives headfirst into the making of one of these games, and he doesn't pull a punch. I mean, that's the important thing, right? He makes sure every card is tweaked to behave in a thematically appropriate way. I know it's one of the things people complain about, right? It's each card being different, but if it wasn't there, the feel would just be lost, and I think that would be a bit of a bummer because it's important to learn.
Oh yeah, you know, it's a big part of what I have come to really love the Phil Eklund games is the educational value. You know, while some of the lessons he teaches aren't necessarily fact, right? There's a especially if you're going through the footnotes, there's a definite kind of tilt, you know, to his beliefs and by extension his teachings, because, you know, he has decided, I mean, quite frankly, for instance, that the bankers of the Renaissance were the most powerful beings on earth. Mm-hmm. You know, that they were the primary agents of change, which is probably debatable in the sense of if there was no banking, would there still have been holy wars? If there was no banking, you know, would there still have been, you know, the Renaissance? Essentially, would the Renaissance even happen if there was no bankers? And that's all debatable, right? I mean, it's an easy argument to make that, yeah, absolutely, you know, the banking systems allowed investments. You know, these are huge advancements that have built the world we live in. You know, so there's validity to that, but there's also validity to the positions where, you know what, if there wasn't a lick of money ever invented, holy wars would still be happening. You know, so I mean, there's arguments either way, but if you put that aside, though, just to get you to the point where you can even have those conversations, though, these games are tremendously valuable, and it's part of what makes them so frustrating. And I'll actually step away from the historical games we've been talking about to his science games. It is incredibly frustrating for all of the pieces in the game to have these scientific names that are not really relevant to what you're doing, right? Like it doesn't matter. Like in, say, BIOS Origins, it's currency, right? What you are spending to buy genes, what you are spending, it's all currency. However, in the game, it's called a catalyst, and then you spend that catalyst, and it becomes an enzyme, and it's still doing the same thing. It's still the same piece, but it has changed names because of where it's at, and I shouldn't say it's doing the same thing. It's doing a different job now, so it has a different name. And that disc will travel around, and as it goes to each new place, it becomes a new name. And the rule book and the cards will reference its state, not that it's a disc of currency, right? And that is part of where the frustration comes and where the wall is when you try to learn these games, because you're reading about the catalyst disc, and then you turn a magic page. Like when you go from page 9 to page 10, suddenly you're talking about the enzyme disc. Mm-hmm. And that can be hard to track. I mean, it really can. They're the same disc, they just moved. And that's just that one thing. Like every aspect of the game does that, to where these tokens, these cubes, over here it's referred to, as mana. Then up here over here it's referred to as a gene, and over here it's an organ. And again, the game, just as you're going through the rule book, it starts changing the names of that cube depending on where it's at, and referencing it as such, and even on the cards referencing it as such. And then when you are in the middle of the game, when you're learning, and you go, oh wait, what's an organ cube do? You go to the organ cube thing, and it says C chromosome cube. So then you go back to the chromosome cube, and it says, C mana cube, and then you go back to mana cube, and suddenly now you've had to consult 6 pages to get to what your question was. And that is honestly frustrating. But I will say, when you are, because the rulebook does that, and it stodgily does that, and it will not do it any other way, it kind of forces you to use that terminology in game. And by the time we got to the end of our game of BIOS Genesis, we are now you and I both are taking our catalysts and putting them on the enzyme space and using that enzyme space to produce a protein, and suddenly, as we're playing, that vernacular is flying back and forth across the table, and anyone who walked into the room would have thought we were, a couple of doctorate level scientists discussing, chemical reactions in the primordial ooze. You end up, because the game forces you to take those paths, you end up using the lingo, and honestly, you end up understanding it better. Yeah. And it has taught you something, and you have learned something. And man, as much as it makes you kind of walk uphill both ways, sometimes I think it's kind of worth it. I feel a little bit smarter having done it. And I think that's, kind of neat that we end up having those discussions and referring to those things, and or talking science, not talking a game, and that's pretty valuable, I think.
Oh, it is. This is one of the myriad topics I would love to talk with. I need a whole lunch session, just a whole lunch session with him to understand why he does and how he does everything he does. But jargon is embedded in every single professional culture, right? And each branch of history, and especially science, has its own unique subset of the larger, already isolated professional culture that they're in, and therefore has its own jargon that's completely saturated in. And yeah, there's tons of essays about, the benefits and the use of jargon in professional languages. But, personally, I get hit in the face with this really early on when I, kind of stepped out in design, And I was having these days where I would talk to an engineer, and then I would talk to another designer, and then I would talk to a machinist, and then I would talk to someone who only worked in digital fabrication. And the amount of frustration that I had at the same object being called 6 different things, depending on the other person in the conversation, it wasn't healthy. And but it was more the attitude of people wondering why they were wasting their time talking to me if I didn't know their terminology, not knowing that I had just got off the phone with someone who was using a completely different set of terms. So the opacity of jargon is incredibly frustrating, but I think more hard to deal with sometimes is the sort of assumed absolute truthfulness of jargon, that the proper noun of what we're referring to is somehow carries more value than the concept that we're communicating, and that without the proper noun, the concept doesn't exist. Like, that was, oh my gosh. Like, I would be on the phone for 20 minutes, and then I would have to take the rest of the day off because I was like shaking because I was so mad, and my wife would have to talk me down, and it was horrible. And then it finally got explained to me, and it actually got explained to me by a NASA engineer. And that's why I want to talk to Phil about it. And what he said was, every single one of their interdepartmental meetings, they start the session with a definition of terms.
Huh.
And they all sit down and they identify the things that they're talking about, and they extract, they basically extract what the terms are that they're using. And then throughout the whole rest of the meeting, if someone throws out a term that no one knows, boom, the hand goes up. Hey, let's define that term. And then everyone defines that term, because each different office could be using the same term to mean fundamentally different things. And you can't afford to have confusion in a situation like that. And so their entire culture is very different from sort of almost like a non-critical profession, where in a non-critical profession, jargon largely is a sign of almost like accomplishment, right? And prestige. It's like name dropping without people being involved, right? And
right, job security even.
Yeah, because no one can speak the language. And so,
right.
Therefore they must come to us because we're hiding everything behind this veil of code, right? And oh man, we're about to get mail. But anyway,
lawyer.
But the hilarity is that when it's incredibly critical and there's life safety issues, as in the case of extra atmospheric travel and that kind of stuff, that all goes away, and they very quickly have to get everything on the table and communicate in very precise terms, and there's no pride in it. It just is about communicating ideas. I can fully understand how, and again, this is where I would love to talk to him about this, but from him, where jargon isn't necessarily something that's there to hide and obfuscate, jargon is actually there to very precisely determine what it is you're talking about and in what context. I bet to him it's freeing, and it's actually sort of a layer of explanation that sort of sits on top of having to explain it as a narrative.
Oh yeah, I think so too. I would almost. I don't even know if it's subconsciously, and it may be just subconsciously for him for what you talked about. But I think it is very much an idea of him wanting this game to be as scientifically accurate as possible. And he doesn't want someone to play it, enjoy it, love the topic, and then find themselves talking about enzymes when they actually are talking about catalysts. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I bet that is something that would really bother him, that he would take it on himself as a teacher, that he had misled you, and now you are interchanging these terms about things that aren't the same, and now, your education is less because of it.
Well, and we know that he takes that role of a teacher very, very, very seriously, because that's why he keeps re-releasing new editions of these games that are slightly tweaked as science changes in its understanding of things. So yeah, he absolutely takes that role seriously. But I think that, as gamers, this is another one of those little tweaks we have to have in our mindset when we approach one of his games, where instead of thinking that he's talking down to us, he's literally just ripping back the curtain and saying, here is tons of information. And furthermore, I'm actually showing you that all of this stuff refers to the same thing in different contexts. He's actually showing you how simple it is. And that's just a little tweak. And I think if people embrace that instead of being frustrated about how falsely complicated it is, I think that they might walk away with more excitement about it, because it goes far beyond just education in terms of like, memory items. Here's a vocab word or whatever. He's actually showing you complex concepts, but more importantly, I really want to talk more about the science game, so I know we're going to be here for like another 3 hours. But
no, we're not going to do that. I mean, we can do another show on the science game specifically.
We should,
and I would like to.
Should. But
I would like to.
But even like with with the science stuff, and we'll come back to that later, because I absolutely think we should talk about this again. But even with the historical stuff, he's showing you the interconnectedness and the relationships. And he's taking something incredibly complicated. I mean, having all of these layers on top of one another is so complicated. And history would not be a profession that would have any longevity to it if it was easy just to figure out, like, oh, this happened and that happened, and here's the reason why. Done. One book got written, and we never need to touch that again. Like, that's not how this works. Yeah. We can constantly go back and re-explore history and learn more about it because we understand the relationships from different contexts and different, even with different priorities. I mean, one of the biggest keys to history is understanding motivations, and understanding motivations comes from understanding the culture at that time, which is really hard to do when that's not our culture anymore. And he's giving us a way to understand those connections, even if we don't have our brains totally saturated in contemporary culture of whatever the historical thing is we're talking about. And that's great. And if you can just embrace it and understand that it's actually making these things simple. It's not making them complicated. It's keeping them intact. That's for sure. I mean, there's nothing left out. However, it is actually being laid out in a very simple way. Man, those games pay dividends. They absolutely pay dividends.
Yeah, and he's, parts of it too, like, I don't know him personally. Like, I don't know his sense of humor. But just, there are things in there that kind of make me laugh. And, I'm curious to know if it's kind of a jokey thing for him, or if it is just the way his brain is working and the way, everything has a reason. And I don't know if you noticed it when we were playing Genesis. It's a game about evolution, right? And evolution is a lot of randomness. It's a lot of things just happening. And kind of the definition of evolution is there is no hand directing it, right? And by its very nature, when you make a game about evolution, you are no longer making a game about evolution. You have, by making any part of it manipulatable in any way, you have now made it a game of intelligent design. And there's just no way around that, right? Because you have control over it. So in Genesis, all the science is full of science jargon, as we talked about. But every single thing that is a direct result of player interaction with the game has a divine name in the rules, right? So the catastrophes that come, like let's go back for a little bit more. So the little square, the little cubes that are the primordial ooze, that are the things just floating around, that we don't really know if that's what it was or not, and this or that. The parts of this that are kind of, fuzzy science a little bit, those are called mana. Right? Yeah. and the parts of the earth, like we know things happen, but we don't know if they are necessarily linked or not. It's all conjecture, right? That mechanic is called smiting. When the mana is destroyed, it's called smiting. In the game, it's not called, like, asteroid impaction or anything science-y. It's literally called a smite. And the the snowball Earth that can happen, or the hot box that turns Earth into Venus. Those are called Armageddons. Those aren't called. Everything in there that is kind of revolves around a game mechanic instead of a random science, or either a random thing or a science-based reaction. Has kind of a mystical name, and I just thought that was so clever and funny, and I don't know if it was commentary or what, but it just made me smile every time I encountered one of those.
Yeah, that's one of those little things that I would love to just say, all right, Phil, please explain.
Yeah,
because he obviously has has the presence of mind to be able to take lots of disparate information and find a way through it. But that was definitely one of those topics that he kind of threaded the needle on, and I would be very interested to hear, sort of where he drew the line and how he did. But yeah, I mean, all of his science games do such a great, and we don't need to talk about those yet because that's going to start a thing. But
right. Yeah, we'll save it. I just want to get that thing out there about the kind of I think even in our game, that little biotin thing or whatever it's called, like I was just calling, like, here I'm going to put my God particle here, and it just kind of took on a life of its own because of that. So I thought it was worth mentioning.
Well, I still hold that you need to start a series where you're just like, don't panic.
Yeah, right. Don't panic. PAX Renaissance is for you.
Banking made easy. 6 easy classes to being a Renaissance banking master.
Right. Today's Phil Eklund glossary definition: repressed cube, a cube that has been repressed. Thanks, Phil.